Good morning, afternoon to everybody around the world joining us today. I noticed in the chat there's some people from all over the world, which is incredible to see. Over the past week, you may have joined us for the other two episodes of Together While Apart in the webinar series, focusing on classroom communication and instructional delivery. If you missed those, we'll be sharing a URL for you to catch up on them at the end of this session. I want to welcome you to the third and sadly the final installment of the series, with theme today being online assessment. So my name, as some of you can see me, some of you may have met me before, my name's Jason Gibson. I'm part of the professional and educational services team. I'm a professional services consultant, and I'm based out of Turnitin's Newcastle office in the UK. And I'm going to be your host for today. I'm also joined today by veteran teacher and Turnitin Senior Manager of Teaching and Learning Innovations, who is Patty West-Smith. Patty joins us from Pittsburgh in the US. But before we start the session, we just want to cover off some basic housekeeping rules. So as this is a webinar, all lines are muted. So if you do want to say anything, if you use the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. Don't submit questions in the chat. We can only manage questions in the Q&A. So if you please submit your questions there. You can send questions at any time. We will answer those. We have a team answering questions throughout, and we'll also answer some of your questions live at the end. And the webinar recording will be available in around about 2 days, so around about 48 hours after this one. If you do have any questions after the session, if you email communications-emea@turnitin.com, we'll be more than happy to do that. So we're here today because education in particular is changing. Challenges that several months ago we would never have imagined, obviously are now part of our day-to-day lives. Institutions have had to adjust their entire structures, and for many educators that's meant being thrust into distance learning environments without time to study or plan. Some of us, it was overnight. So here we are in this new world with teachers learning new methods and tools to achieve the same great outcomes that they had in the classroom, and students are having new ways of learning and finding new ways to learn. And if there's one takeaway from all of this, it's that remote learning challenges the norms of education across the spectrum, because obviously, we have to make that change. Obviously, that underlying fact presents obstacles for all aspects of learning, but perhaps most impacted is the area of assessment. At its core, assessment is about understanding what students know, understand, and what they can do. And when all of that assessment takes place in a remote context, some unique challenges can arise. So with that said, in this final episode of Together While Apart series, we'll explore the area of assessment in a remote and potentially asynchronous learning environment. For those of you that couldn't make the previous session, so the last two that we had, Patty, can you just tell us a bit about yourself and why you're here today?
Sure. So I am an education veteran. I have about 23 years of experience in education and education technology. I started out my career in public education in the United States. I've done everything from assistant in a summer school reading program all the way up to the principal of a building and then the supervisor of instructional programs for a whole school district. I've also taught at the higher education level, particularly in teacher preparation programs. And I have a couple different degrees in education and educational leadership and literacy. And a lot of my work has been focused around curriculum development related to research, writing, literacy, language learning. And then about 4 years ago, I had the opportunity to come to Turnitin, where I took over heading up the team of teaching and learning innovations. Originally, we were focused in the US, but we've broadened our scope to work around the world and across all of Turnitin's products to make sure that our work is aligned to the genuine needs of instructors in the field. And my team is entirely composed of educators.
Wow, that's awesome. So thank you very much, Patty, for sharing that. And like I say, for those of you that did miss the last ones that we did, you can obviously click that link at the end of today's session. So just before we get into the kind of the meat of everything today, just want to establish some consistent definitions. So assessment is a term that is used in many different ways depending on the context. So exactly how are you defining assessment for the purpose of our discussion today?
Oh, so this is a really good question, and it's important to sort of set our expectations to make sure we're all aligned and on the same page. Assessment can really mean a lot of different things to different people, and it is and always has been a critical component of the learning process. It is not separate from learning, and I think that's an important distinction to be made, because what that means is when we talk about assessment, we're talking about any measure that an instructor takes to get a gauge of where students are in their learning process, what they've mastered, what they're still struggling with. And that obviously includes things like tests and quizzes and exams, but it also includes informal assessments and more formative assessments along the learning process. It includes genuine products like papers and performances and demonstrations, labs and experiments. All of these things are forms of assessment that allow teachers to have some insight into learning that is happening for students. It also serves as a really important element of feedback for students so that they can gauge their own progress along the way. So when we talk about assessment, it is not limited to high stakes assessments or exams at the end of a course. It really does include all of those aspects of measuring students' learning and understanding along the way. Because in reality, at the end of the day, how will a teacher truly know whether each individual student has mastered the content if they aren't assessing along the way? So it really is a fundamental part of the educational process that we have to handle carefully. And obviously the challenges around that in our current climate with remote learning and distance learning and blended learning and all the varieties that are happening around the world, there are some very nuanced complications that come from that. And that's what we want to talk about today.
Yeah, so it is actually really complicated. And one of the big challenges that we're seeing is, it's how can we actually get students to establish that right mindset so they can take assessment seriously when they're at home?
This is incredibly complex. I mean, this is a difficult enough challenge in a physical classroom, right, to get students to take assessments very seriously. But it becomes even more complicated today. We have students at home in their bedrooms or at the kitchen table, and that is, by its very nature, a very relaxed setting for students. And so you can see where their habits start to shift to be more aligned to that environment. That becomes a real issue for instructors, particularly when it comes to assessment. We need students to take it very seriously and have the same mindset that they would in the classroom. So there are some things that we can do to help establish that right mindset. The first thing goes back to something I talked about in some of the previous webinars, and this is the idea of over communicating, meaning don't assume that students know and believe the same things that you would expect them to in other circumstances. You have to state it explicitly. Document it, state it, reiterate it, because you need them to be in the right mindset. After all, your purpose in assessment is to gain insight into their learning. That means you need them to take it seriously, and you need to know that it's authentic and genuine to the individual student. The first step to doing that is to get them to think about assessment in that way. We don't want them to think about it as a gotcha moment where you can catch what they don't know, or that you're only using it to assign a grade. You really need the insight into their learning so that you can use their education meaningfully for them. I think once you have that mindset and communicate it to students, it starts to shift the dynamic there around assessment. One of the other things you can do along these lines is to build in a process where students have some buy-in, right? So take the time to talk to them about what is appropriate conduct. I recommend a strategy that I call this, not that. And it's basically just a 2-column chart where you start to identify, these are the behaviors I want you to assume. These are the behaviors I don't want you to assume. And I would encourage instructors to have a conversation where students help to engage in that process of building those norms around behavior. What are the things you should and should not do in an assessment situation? I think by making that process transparent, talking about it explicitly, documenting it, and coming to an agreement and consensus as a class, you sort of build a community of academic integrity where you have all sort of bought into the same understandings around what's appropriate and what isn't. And sometimes that it sets the right mindset for the students and also allows them to self-police to a certain extent so that you don't have to be the only one who is setting those norms. This is what our community of learning, our learning community, has agreed to do and not do. So it doesn't put the teacher in that purely sort of authoritarian position. It's more a culture of community and an agreed set of norms.
Yeah, because if you're like clearly articulating what you expect and what the honor code is of the institution, it's more likely, or it seems more likely, that the students would at least understand the requirements.
Absolutely. And you know, that is the first step, right? Is making sure they're aware of and understand the requirements. And that's why I also advocate for explicitly reviewing the honor code. I've been in systems where people have said, well, I know they reviewed that in their homeroom class, or I know they reviewed that in their freshman year. They had to sign off on it at the beginning of the process, or so-and-so instructor talked about that. But that doesn't necessarily assume that they will carry over that understanding to your class. So I think it's important to take the time to review it in your context. And if you did that in person, and now you're in a remote setting, it's probably important to revisit it to serve as that sort of concrete reminder that even though we're not in a physical classroom, I still have those expectations for you. The expectations of the institution remain the same.
Yeah. So when it comes to the actual assessment design itself, how would I go about like designing an assessment so that I can trust that the students' work is their own, that it is authentic?
So it's interesting because teachers actually have a lot of power and control in that process because we design the actual assessment product and the questions that are used to assess students' understanding. And we can do a lot of things in that process that give us a lot more control and set some very clear boundaries around what you're expecting. So for example, you can start to think about performance assessments as opposed to strictly thinking about sort of multiple choice or short answer or even extended answer questions. And what do we mean by performance assessments? So performance assessments are oftentimes have multiple pieces that build toward a final product. They oftentimes have a more real world application involved. So for example, you might be asking students to conduct some research as opposed to simply answering a series of questions. Or you might, it depends very much on the context of your course and your content, what the performance might be. But think about if there is a real world application of their learning, that kind of performance of that learning is a better demonstration of their overall mastery. It also gives you a much higher degree of confidence that the work is authentic, right? Because it's much harder to, I mean, it's easy to Google the answer to a question, frankly. Let's just be honest about that. It's simple to do and it's tempting to do. But if you create performance assessments and students have to actually apply their learning, then you have a much greater insight into their work and their learning, and then also a higher degree of trust that the work you're seeing actually is that student's. The other aspect of performance assessments is that you can often personalize them. Again, this depends on your content area, but there are ways in which you can give students choices around topics that they're interested in that relate to your content as well. So for example, an example I like to use is we've seen students who are teachers who are teaching a course in a different language. Now, they want students to demonstrate their understanding of that language, but they can do that through a variety of topics. When you can allow the students to make those kind of choices, then they're more engaged in the process. Again, you also have an additional measure that says to me, I know that Patty is interested in, let's say, fashion, for example. So it is much more likely that what she is doing, say, interviewing a famous designer, is a personalized assessment, but I can still see what she has mastered and what she hasn't. That's not always possible, don't get me wrong. That doesn't work with every content area or every subject matter. But to the degree that you can, it does increase the student's engagement with the assessment process, and it does give you another measure of looking to see whether it's authentically their work.
Yeah. So basically by engaging the students more with the assessment itself, then instructors can make it more likely that the students are actually completing their own work.
Absolutely. If I'm suddenly writing about baseball, for example, you can be fairly certain that it isn't my work. And so there's an element of really knowing your students that comes through in that. And it's also so much more likely that they're going to be passionate about the product they produce.
Awesome. So the benefit seemed to be that you could cut down the likelihood of students cheating, but you could also force them to think more deeply. Is that right?
Absolutely. And so it's important for us to think about our questions themselves. You know, most instructors are familiar with different systems that talk about higher order thinking. So we want to encourage students to think at the higher cognitive end of the work. So a very simple example is I could ask students, what is the definition of a metaphor? That's a perfectly relevant and reasonable question that I might ask in, say, a poetry class. However, if I ask students to identify and analyze the use of a metaphor in a particular passage, then I still can see that they know what a metaphor is, but they're thinking much more deeply about it. That cuts down on the ease of sort of Googling that answer or coming up with an easy answer, but it also forces them to apply their learning in a much more meaningful way. So we know that they're activating different parts of their brain when they're answering questions like that, as opposed to very simple rote memorization or rote identification type questions. So we want to push them toward those higher cognitive levels. It's a better assessment for us to make sure that they have a deeper understanding of the concept, but it also cuts down on the likelihood that they'll be tempted to cheat.
Cool. So how could we use, because obviously we're a technology company, how could we use technology to minimize issues with academic integrity?
So this is an interesting question, and the technology around this is continuing to evolve. So I think the answer today is different than it was a year ago, and it is certainly different than it will be a year from now, probably. But there are some basic mechanisms that we can use that sort of build into our classroom practice and our classroom culture. So one of the things I recommend is that you require that students read and sign off on the honor code at the beginning of a formal assessment. This is a practice that assessment experts recommend in any setting. Actually, it's highly recommended across the board, but in remote instruction in particular, they recommend it because it sort of forms a very formal, concrete kickoff of the assessment to be a very clear sign that we are now in an assessment scenario. B, it almost acts as a contract between you and the student. I have read and acknowledged that I am required to follow these standards. It becomes sort of a formalization of the process. And you can almost see, just in that moment, I don't know if you noticed, but I sat up straighter when I said that. And the same kind of thing happens to students. It sort of formalizes their conduct as a very visceral reminder that I'm in an assessment scenario, and the expectations are that I follow this honor code. You can do this in a number of ways. There are very simple ways where you simply just make it the first item on your assessment, on your exam or test, and students click off just in the way that you would often on many online applications that you would use where you have to click a box that you agree. And that's fairly easy to set up. But you can do it in a more formalized way too. There are document signature fields that you can set where you require that they accept the policy before they can move on to the assessment. And many of those things are free and widely available. Lots of different options out there on the internet that you can find. And some may even be built into your learning management system or different technology platforms that you're using. But however you do it, I think it's an important step to really set the right context for your assessment.
For sure. So that kind of step where you're creating, putting that stuff in place, that creates both documentation, but it also reminds people of the expectations that we have of them.
Right.
Awesome. So what sort of process do we need to go through when it comes to, establishing a process for how we evaluate things like similarity, and how do we make that consistent?
So obviously for Turnitin users, this is probably the easiest of my recommendations, because if you're using our tools, then you're probably already accustomed to doing this. But there are some things that you can do that will help to make that a more effective process. One of the things I recommend is that you do some front loading. You talk to students about it beforehand. You tell them about the tool you're using, show it to them, demonstrate for them what the findings might look like, what they mean, and how you're going to interpret and respond to those. It's better to pre-warn them than it is to surprise them at the end. So take the time to discuss it up front and make sure they have a good understanding of what your expectations are, as well as how the tool works. So that's the first thing. You're sort of arming them with the right knowledge to go into it with the right set. The second thing that is really critical is that you use it consistently. If you only use it haphazardly, or you set different expectations in different scenarios, it can be easy for students to get confused about when it is required, when it isn't. That doesn't suggest that your standards have changed, but by creating that pattern, then you are helping students to create the habit of working to those expectations. They become much more familiar with the tool, which means they're more comfortable. They have a better understanding of what you're going to ask from them, how to use it. It takes out a lot of these sort of bumps in the road that can come up when you use something haphazardly or inconsistently. So talk to them about it up front and then use it repeatedly. I actually even encourage teachers to think about doing a practice run, something that isn't high stakes attached to it, where they go through the process of using the tool, get back their report, and then you talk to them about it. It sets a very good example for them, so that then they have that sort of low stakes environment where they don't have a lot of anxiety and the repercussions are not sort of frightening. And they can really get an idea of what to expect for the next situation, where you will have higher stakes attached to it.
Cool. So would you do any kind of like pre-testing kind of things, like setting things up, making sure it was pre-tested so everybody knew what was going on ahead of time?
I would actually walk through that whole process with a demonstration. I would show them someone else's work, an anonymous piece of work, walk through, point out things that I find problematic and that would be concerning to me as an instructor, even ask them, do you think this should be concerning to me? Why might this have happened? What steps can we take to make sure this doesn't happen? All of that really sets the right mindset and gives everyone the practice at figuring out the ins and outs of how it's going to work, so that when they go into the real world situation and apply it to their own work, they are 100% clear about your expectations, the tool itself, and what they need to do in response to it. It really cuts down a lot on inconsistencies or questions or sort of gray areas if you take that time up front to walk through it.
Yeah. And if we have like a test administration sort of environment, or, to set up those parameters, it'll probably make it easier, if you've got that testing environment, makes it a lot easier for the teacher and for the student, because they're kind of used to that way of doing things.
Absolutely. So you want to try to anticipate as many potential issues as possible. So you really have to plan ahead in a remote learning context. You have to think very carefully about, where will my assessment sit? What are the time bounds around it? And you make sure that you communicate those very clearly to students. It's also important that you have sort of a backup plan, right? Because there will be students in an asynchronous situation where they're not reporting to class at a specific time. So you have to have a default for them, because what if, for example, now that they're at home, they're in a different time zone? We've talked to instructors who said, I scheduled my exam for the same time that my class would normally meet, but it turns out one of my students is halfway around the world, and that's the middle of the night for her. Right? So you have to think about those things ahead of time. Make sure that you communicate them to students and give them at least a little bit of an opportunity to talk to you if there are potential problems, so that you can figure out the best way to get around those. So it's still an equitable access situation for students. You aren't blocking students out for conditions that are really outside of their control.
Cool. So if we think about kind of just the overall experience for a student when it comes to assessment through this, like what's the best way, would you say, for students to maybe voice concerns, or to talk to their teachers about this, and talk to the when it comes, because assessment is an important time for students. So is there a time that you would say, like, is there a good way for people to do that?
Well, so particularly with technology, I think it's important to look into what's available, right? Whether it's offered by your institution or something you've selected on your own, and really weigh out the pros and cons, the risks and benefits of using it. You have to do that for yourself to make sure that you're aware of what the pitfalls are, but you also need to do it with students, because one of the things that we know for sure is that students come from diverse places. And diverse cultures. And so values vary, cultural norms vary, and there are genuine concerns that can come up around some of the technology applications. It's important to do things like shutting down browser capabilities so that students aren't, off on another tab looking up an answer, or collaborating in the background in a way that's inappropriate. You do want to shut those things down, and there are great technology tools that can help you to do that work. At the same time, you have to carefully weigh that around student concerns, around things like privacy and what's appropriate for them. And so really talking to them ahead of time about the tool that you're going to use, how you're going to use it, and giving them an opportunity to ask questions, to voice concerns, and then to think about together in sort of a partnership, how can you work around those concerns? What you don't want to do is assume that students want to be dishonest or that they have bad intentions. There are perfectly valid reasons that they might have concerns. So simply taking the time to genuinely listen to those concerns and answer those questions is an important part of making the process appropriate and effective for both your objectives and for the student. You know, in our first session in this series, we talked about the importance of communication in a remote learning situation. And today we're focusing on assessment, but it turns out the communication is still incredibly important. And one of the things we have to remember is that communication is two ways. I've talked a lot over this webinar series about the importance of you communicating things to your students, but it is equally important that you listen to students. And I think when you sort of establish a trusting relationship where you are genuine about listening to them and they are genuine about listening to you, that you get a two-way process that is much more effective for everyone involved. And you can really answer their concerns in a way that makes them feel heard and validated. And think about when things come up that maybe you didn't anticipate. You know, I, for example, don't have any trouble. Obviously, my home is in the background here, and I don't have a problem with that being on camera in this moment. But there are some students that are very uncomfortable around that. And so you have to be thoughtful about those differences among your students and try to respect them to the greatest degree possible.
Yeah, 100% agree. And yeah, you got your home in the background, I've got the kitchen. So, you know, it's we're playing top trumps here. So speaking of taking everyone's opinions, we've got a question here that's actually quite interesting because it's not just the students, obviously, that we think about. So we got a question from Teo, who's actually very happy that this webinar is taking place because very big advocate of online proctored exams. But the question is, how do we change the mindset of colleagues to accept this new way of using technology to, you know, examine students against the traditional approach?
Well, so there are a couple of things that I think are important. One, you know, we have to make sure that we're establishing sort of shared opportunities for communicating about these topics, right? Now that we're all sort of spread to the four corners of the world in our homes, we're not necessarily gathering in lounges or shared faculty spaces or having a faculty meeting where everyone can share their ideas. So you have to be strategic about making sure that you ask the question and listen. And asking the question can often mean pushing people's boundaries to a certain degree. And you want to try to do that not in a way that feels aggressive or assertive, but in a way that genuinely inquires about things. In one of our sessions earlier, someone asked me the question of whether how to stop students from using recorded lectures as an excuse to skip class. And so I responded with the question of, but what's your intention in that lecture? If your intention is to communicate information and they still get that from the recorded lecture, have they really skipped out on anything? So I think oftentimes asking people to think about their objectives and their motives and the things that they're planning and doing helps them to start to see that they maybe have a blind spot or that they've fallen into a pattern of comfort and that it's time to rethink that. And sometimes that can be an awkward conversation. And so you have to be thoughtful about it and figure out what the right context is. I find that some people are willing to have that conversation as a group, and it's okay if there's a bit of an audience when you have a discussion like that. Other people do better when it's a one-on-one conversation. So you have to be thoughtful about that with your colleagues as well. Is this a colleague that's open to having a larger conversation where we're all involved? Or is this a colleague that it might be more beneficial to have that conversation one-on-one? So a lot of those sort of relationship aspects become a part of helping to shift mindset. But there's also the aspect of being able to share your successes. When you are an advocate for something that is a little bit uncomfortable for some of your colleagues, one of the things you can do is share what you have done and how it has been successful, because that helps to build a model that says, look, this is possible, and here's how it was received by students, and help to sort of push them to start to think about things a little differently.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. And yeah, I love the fact that it's still about, you know, how webinars that we've done already about communication, everything all plays a part at each stage. So, you know, you need all three of those things that we've talked about across the weeks. We have another question about control measures. So what control measures can be put in place when assessing students online? Obviously, we mentioned similarity, but, you know, what kind of things can we do?
So it varies a little bit according to your context, but there are a lot of options, I will say. You can do things like there's technology that allows you, I think I mentioned this earlier, to shut down browsing capability while they're involved. So that they're not out searching for answers. You can eliminate other devices. There are things that limit things by geography. I find that one's potentially problematic in remote learning because you can't be certain of the geographical location of each student, and you don't want to shut down access for perfectly legitimate reasons.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of possibilities. You can do things like blocking access to other materials. You can set time limits. That's a very easy one, right? And sometimes we forget about that as a possibility, as a measure we can take that is sort of a very low effort measure. If you know that your assessment should take approximately 1 hour, then don't leave the assessment window open for 12, right? Because that allows for possibilities for other things. So there are some things that are sort of low effort all the way up to high effort. Some of them require specialized tools and platforms that allow for very sophisticated capabilities in terms of what you can set up. And some of them don't, right? Like if you open the window for your assessment for a specific period of time and you have students sign up for that in advance, then you know when and where they will be taking that assessment, and you can really limit things. But here again, I would suggest that it's very important to talk to students about what works, because there can often be legitimate challenges that we haven't anticipated up front because it just isn't a part of our day-to-day experience as instructors. So it's important to have those conversations with students. This is another place where I would strongly advocate that you sort of use your network, your colleagues in your professional learning environments, to talk to them about what they're doing, what works, and what challenges they've run into. And you do also have to consider some very pragmatic concerns, like what kind of funding do you have available to use different types of tools? What's going to work best in your situation? Do you need to integrate it with the tools that you already have? So there are a number of questions that you have to answer up front. And you have to sort of think about that up front. What I would never advocate doing is trying to pick a tool, a brand new tool to use, like say the day before. Make sure you give yourself time to navigate the options and figure out what works best.
For sure. And when we've got a question here from Professor Samir, just in regards to performance assessment. They've asked is, can Bloom's taxonomy be applied to performance assessment?
Absolutely. And oftentimes in performance assessments, you'll see that there are multiple pieces of the performance. It isn't a single episodic event. So there might be almost a portfolio of work that is collected and different aspects of the learning that are shown. And so one of the things that you can think about in that is, how can you use different levels of cognitive questioning and thinking in your different performances? So if you've asked students to read and identify some things, that's kind of low level in Bloom's taxonomy. But then over here, you've asked them to analyze and apply and evaluate multiple pieces and then synthesize it. You can sort of put that together into a collection of assessments so that you can see all aspects of the student's learning. One of the things I often find that's powerful about that is, you're asking different questions and you can get a very good idea of where the learning is breaking down, if it is. Sometimes I find that students maybe are okay with the first couple levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but once I get up here to evaluation and synthesis, they're starting to struggle. And then helps you as the instructor to determine where you want to try to intervene and provide some additional supports. So you can do a lot of things in a performance assessment or a portfolio that allow you to really cover a wide spectrum of the taxonomy of rigor.
Yeah. So we've got another question as well, which actually follows on in regards to performance assessment from Frank here, saying that I think that the use of performance assessment might be difficult for instructors with large class sizes. How can it be used in that sort of instance?
That's true. That can be a complication. It's a thing to think about. And so one of the things you have to sort of, again, I talked about weighing out the risks and benefits of any particular approach. So if you are dealing with very large class sizes, you have to weigh out what are the risks and benefits. One of the things that you can do is stagger deadlines. It isn't necessary that everyone do the same activity at the same time. And so that can help you, for example, with managing grading or scoring their performance assessments. So it may be that Jason wants to do this, all of the easy stuff up front. He wants to turn those in right away, and that should be okay if he has mastered that learning. That will help you to make sure that you don't have this massive amount of performances coming in at the last minute at the same time, which is just going to obviously overwhelm your whole system. So if you can stagger it and help students to figure out how to schedule that appropriately, you can spread it out over time. And then there are situations where it is not going to be possible to do a performance assessment. So you really have to go back to your planning and say to yourself, what is my objective? What kind of assessment do I want to make a performance assessment? And then where is it important that I have sort of a quick and easy mechanism for scoring? And if you put those things together, they can complement one another into a more comprehensive assessment approach.
Cool. So we're getting a lot of questions actually that are, today I would say are some very, very good questions, by the way. And I'm loving how it's, the range that we have. So we've got another question here from Esther Nyagi, saying, for application questions, do they set time limits for completion of the questions? Or is assessment done in an asynchronous manner, or are all learners to be in the same session at the same time? So a lot of a very common question, I think, at the moment.
Absolutely. And this is one of the real challenges around remote learning, particularly when it's asynchronous, is you want to ask yourself, what are the appropriate parameters to put in place for this assessment? So when you're asking an application question, obviously that's going to take a bit more time than a literal recognition type question. So you do want to allow for additional time, but you have to ask yourself, is this an item where I have to be concerned that students are going to collude or look at other resources or do something that violates academic integrity? Or is it possible that students have different needs? Because it may be that one group of students, it's perfectly reasonable to expect they'll complete this in, say, a 10-minute window. Another group of students may need extended time to make that process. And so I think you have to really start by understanding your students and their needs and what's going to work best for your objective. But if you map out for yourself, what is my goal? What is it I need to know and learn from this assessment? Then you can have a very clear idea of which methodology is going to work best. I would say that unfortunately, there's no one right answer. It really does depend on the context of your content and your students and the tools that you have available to you. So you sort of have to step back and take a large overarching view of all of those things and then figure out how they fit together sort of in a puzzle, and then make the best determination for your situation. I know that's not an easy answer, and I'm not trying to avoid the question, but it very much does have to be sort of differentiated for the particular parameters of your situation.
Yeah, and I think it is one of those things. I know I've got a lot of questions here which are about, there's a lot of questions about, how do we change our approach, for things that aren't necessarily typical to online. And I think the answer you've given there for that question really covers a lot of those. You've got to really apply, whatever fits with your situation, don't you?
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges right now is this feeling that we have to do everything at once. But in reality, I think when you're trying to make a big change like this, sometimes the way to manage that best is to pick one thing at a time. You don't try to do everything differently at once. Pick one strategy that you want to work on and really focus on that. If you really want to work on performance assessments, don't change all of your assessments to be performance assessments overnight, because that's going to be overwhelming for you and for students. Pick one that will be very meaningful, that you can manage effectively. And then as you get more practice with it, you'll become more skilled and more efficient. And you'll find that it is easier to broaden that approach and sort of add another layer, another layer, another layer over time.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like you say, it's about not overloading yourself. It's about making sure that you do what you can do, I think is the message really here, isn't it? So that, like I say, we have had a lot of questions today. Unfortunately, we can't get through all of them right now. But what I want to do is, first of all, thank you, Patty, for all those great answers. They were absolutely brilliant. I'm just going to make sure I can share my screen again with everyone. So we mentioned, obviously, that we had a lot of the things that we mentioned today, we mentioned that had been said in previous webinars. And we want to make sure that you can all access those. So we will be uploading today's webinar to this link as well. So all the resources, the videos, downloadable resources, they'll all be on this go.turnitin.com/remote learning. We will also have some blog posts, so there's some related blog posts which you can go to on our site as well, which you can see here. So there's quite a lot of information that you can get from our blog posts. Patty obviously this webinar was created from one of the blog posts that we had, from one of the resources that we have. So, you know, they are incredibly useful. Link. But the last thing I want to say really is thank you so much to Paddy for doing all of these webinars. I think everyone has got a ton of information from you. So I think everyone here, especially all the hundreds of people on the call, thank you from them, but thank you from me as well. I know I've learned a lot over the past few days and over the week. But if anyone does have any questions, like we said, we did have that email address as well that you can contact us on, and you have the link to go to. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Really, really appreciate it. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all.